Thank you again. And for this panel for Trachtenberg School PhD alumni, careers outside of academia, I am going to turn it over to Professor Bert Barno, who will be moderating today's panel.
Great. Thank you, Denise. It's really a pleasure to meet all of our panel members. I want to first start by thanking the panel for coming. This will be exciting. I know one of the members of the panel because I was on his dissertation committee and I learned a lot. And the others I have not met. And actually they came right around when I started or before I started at GW. So these are very experienced alums since I've been here 13 years. And I'd like to thank all of our students who have come to hear this. I think it's great when people come and learn about different jobs. So we have about an hour, and I want to just briefly introduce the panel today. We have Catherine Rogers, and Catherine is the Director of Long-Term Care at the Department of Healthcare Finance for the DC government. We've got Ryan Baker, and Ryan works for the Center. Oh, it's right. It's not called it used to be called the Center for Naval Analysis, but it's now called CNA, which I think stands for, or used to stand for Center for Naval Analysis. We have Daniel Coogan, who's the Acting Director for the Office of Resources and Business Operations at EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And we have Crystal Vardaman, who's the Managing Principal at Aurora Health Group. So what I'd like to do is start off by asking you, each of you on the panel, to introduce yourself, talk about your career path, and what you do as a non-academic with a PhD, and how your PhD training helps or gets in the way for your job. And I guess we can start. I'll go around the screen starting at my bottom left. I know everybody's screen's different, so I'll start with Crystal.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Crystal Vardaman, and again, I am a managing principal with Aurora Health Group. We are a mission-driven health policy consulting firm. Work primarily with states, foundations, federal government, other mission-driven clients doing health policy analysis, design, and implementation. So, for example, working with state Medicaid programs to design and implement programs. For example, I'm working on a program right now with California as they're moving some enrollees into a managed care program. So supporting the state with policy design, stakeholder engagement, managing work groups for the state, and doing education and outreach to prepare stakeholders for the go live date in January and ensure that Medi-Cal enrollees have a smooth transition to a new healthcare delivery system. But to back up a little bit, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my career path and how my PhD has played a role in it. I entered the program in the fall of 2009. And at the time, I was working, I spent about 15 years in the federal government prior to moving back to consulting. Started off my career after getting my master's in public health from Chapel Hill, moved to DC to work for a health policy consulting firm. Worked for a couple of years and got sort of the desire to go back to school again. And at that time, I had started working for the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, and was a great place to be able to think about pursuing a PhD because, of course, the flexibility that the program offers to do the core classes at night, and GAO was very supportive of me going back to school. I actually had at least one other colleague who was there who was doing a similar program. And so was able to use that flexibility to go back to school. Worked GAO throughout my whole coursework period, and then moved to another agency, MACPAC, the Medicaid and CHIP Payment Access Commission, during my dissertation phase, which helped kind of frame some of my, the way I pursued my dissertation in terms of framing the topic and what I decided to pursue in that respect, and then moved into consulting. So I would say in terms of how the PhD has played a role, I knew when I was at GAO and decided to go back to school that I was interested in really an applied research setting. I was thinking about like think tanks and other kind of opportunities and wanted to really get the deep methodological training I had a public health master's degree and wanted a public policy focus for my PhD to kind of round out my approach to health policy. And so I think, that was something I definitely got from the program, the ability to really review health policy from a different lens. Public health had provided me a sense of health education and epidemiology and other kind of health framing. And here at GW, I got more training in the budgeting and financing portions, more of that public policy lens, public administration lens to be able to lend to the work that I was doing in the government and now helping support governments. So I definitely think it was helpful in that respect. Again, getting deeper into different methods has been useful. I've really done a couple of, applied research type work, GAO and MacPac, and now in consulting. While I'm doing more operational work, I am working with state governments and implementing programs. And so having that public administration training and really being able to see, how things work on the ground and bring some of my past training to bear to the work has been useful. So I'm sure I'll have more time to dig into that later, but I'll turn it back to you, Bert.
Thank you. Thanks, Crystal. Okay, Ryan, why don't you go next?
All right, thanks, Bert. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ryan Baker. I'm currently with the Center for Naval Analyses, and I'll say a little bit more about that organization in a minute. But first, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. So I got my professional start in the Marine Corps. After college, I went on active duty for about 5 years and did a couple of deployments as an active duty Marine. Knowing always in the back of my mind that I wanted to go to grad school and kind of burnish my academic credentials a little bit, and didn't really like the opportunities that the Marine Corps had available at the time. And so after about 5 years, I dropped from the active duty side of the force and became a reservist. And then I went to GW to get first my master's degree and then my PhD. I joined with the fall of 2012. That's when I started, I think, at Trachtenberg. I was a full-time student in the program evaluation program or track, so working with Kathy Newcomer and Bert. And then I just had a wonderful experience in the program. I lucked out in a lot of respects. I got to do some cool things both down at the Elliott School and also up at the Trachtenberg School, and then defended my dissertation ultimately in March of 2020. So right as COVID kind of hit and just torpedoed the job market, which was not awesome at the time. Fortunately, though, I stayed affiliated with the Marine Corps as a reservist, and they came knocking. So I ended up going back on active duty during COVID, working at the Pentagon. And just pure happenstance, I ended up falling into the COVID-19 cell at Headquarters Marine Corps and became the lead analyst for the Marine Corps on COVID-19. So I ended up writing all of the scripts to do all the database management, built all the data visualizations, did all the briefings, ended up answering questions for everyone across the government that had an interest in COVID and how it sort of affected the Marine Corps, which turned out to be great preparation for then jumping eventually to CNA, which I was able to do in 2021. So now I'm a research scientist there. The Center for Naval Analyses is kind of like a think tank, but it's an FFRDC, which is it means essentially that we have a special status in federal regulation, which gives us special access to DoD in particular and the Navy and the Marine Corps. And in exchange for that, we accept a healthy dose of regulation. So there are a lot of things that we can't do by virtue of the fact that we're an FFRDC. But we do get to kind of do studies and analyses for our sponsors, mostly the Navy and the Marine Corps, but we do work for other parts of the government as well, mostly in DoD, but there's some in the intelligence community, there's some in other parts of the sort of the national security bureaucracy, DHS and elsewhere. Me personally, given my background, I do the vast majority of my work for the Marine Corps, but I do use my PhD every day. We are prohibited from doing staff work. We are there to do analysis for our sponsors, and that analysis can take a variety of different forms. Everything from discrete projects like, hey, can you answer this research question for me, to serving as the analytical voice in the room, in a forward deployed environment. So right now there are a couple of folks with CNA that are deployed on aircraft carriers that happen to be responding to current events overseas. So it is a very diverse kind of environment in that respect. But but also very analytically oriented and very research intensive. And so you get to use a lot of the skills that you pick up in this program on a regular basis, because that's the whole, I mean, that's the raison d'etre for the organization. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Okay, Daniel, please unmute. Okay, there you
Thanks. Hey everyone, I'm Dan. So I work at the Environmental Protection Agency primarily on operational matters that affect across our range of national programs. The big thing that I work on now is helping to implement the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and a separate set of funding EPA received through the Inflation Reduction Act. The first legislation was much more focused on infrastructure projects, as the name suggests, around the country, a lot of it water infrastructure. The latter, Inflation Reduction Act, is a lot of projects related to climate and mitigating climate issues, working with states, tribes, and communities. So between the two, Congress gave EPA $100 billion. So it's a lot of work, not just hiring people up, but building grant programs, working with recipients like states or tribes to understand the requirements of receiving federal funding. So that's how I spend a lot of my time now. Prior to this, more of my time at GW, I started, it was somewhat similar to everyone else. I started at it wasn't even called the Trachtenberg School yet, but did my MPP. Then I left, worked for a while, and then with Crystal and Catherine, started in 2009, I think, for PhD program, and finished in 2012 or 2013. And so for me, my career has morphed. I've moved much more into management the last several years. So a lot of the really great skills I learned doing R, and a lot of the stats I don't get to use on a regular basis. But I think the big thing for me that I continue to use regularly, and just seeing Catherine and Crystal, is, for years, just being in class and having to digest a lot of information quickly and then make a case with my class and convey ideas to other very smart people and hear them and take it back and forth. That's something that I still use on a daily basis. And I think for Trachtenberg was a huge credit for me from my classes, especially in the PhD side. So happy to take questions, but I'll turn it over to Catherine.
Thanks, Dan. And I'm really glad to be here. My name's Catherine. Where to start? My name's Catherine Rogers. I'm the Director of Long-Term Care Administration, the Long-Term Care Director for the district's Medicaid program. There are many interesting things about working for the government of the District of Columbia. It's a unique place to be in general, and I hope all of you are capitalizing on that, but also a very interesting government to work for, because, and I'm just such a state policy nerd, so hopefully some of that will come through a little bit, but it's, the district government has to perform the functions of like 3 different levels of government, from typically state functions to county functions, because there are no counties, and a bunch of city or metropolitan functions as well. One of those state functions is operating a state Medicaid agency, and the Medicaid program in the district covers about 40% of all district residents and provides healthcare coverage through both the Medicaid program as well as a locally funded program for people who do not meet the eligibility criteria for Medicaid in one way or another, but qualify for the Alliance program. The long-term care system, many of you, all of the health policy folks on the call know that Medicaid's a primary payer for long-term services and supports nationwide. And so as a result, in the Medicaid program, we have about 300,000 people in the program. Only about 4% of them actually use long-term care, but we are spending about 1/3 of our budget on long-term services and supports. So going back to the beginning, I was not a long-term care person before I linked up with DC Medicaid a long time ago. I came to DC originally in 2007 to do also an MPH, just like Crystal, at GW. I really enjoyed my MPH, and that's actually why I applied to a PhD program, is I really enjoyed school. And I just really enjoyed the classes I took, and I was a health policy MPH, and I just really, it was my first, I was actually an animal science major in college, and so it was the first time I really talked about policy in an academic setting, and it was just incredibly rewarding and stimulating and all of those things. So I went right from my MPH into my PhD program, but like Crystal mentioned, like I had this sort of public health focus from the my master's program, but I really did want to lean more into the public policy side, and that ended up also leaning me into the public administration side, which I did not expect, but was a unexpected benefit once I got there. My first, I did my PhD part-time in, just like Crystal mentioned. And my first job after my MPH was with a small nonprofit focused on adolescent health issues. And that was because I moved here after teaching high school. And I really was interested in how we communicate about public health and educate people about public health, because that had been where I was coming from. And I was really interested in child and adolescent and maternal health. I came from there to DC government because I had started taking all these quant classes and was like, man, research is so cool. Let's do that forever. And I joined the data and analytics team here at the agency in 2011. I did that and I managed that team for a little while and was like, I want to do research for the rest of my life, which was surprising to me because with a teaching background, and I do really love to teach, what kept me coming back for more with the PhD program was actually the research and not the prospect of teaching, though I found ways to scratch that itch. In other places, I volunteer in English language programs, so I do still teach, find other ways to teach. So I went to a federal contractor for a time because I thought that I would just do research forever there, and I did do some research, but I did a lot of operations support for federal contracts as well. And an incidental comment from a colleague sort of made me come back to the Medicaid agency, which was really about my career trajectory and being in the leadership of important public programs like the Medicaid program. And so I returned to the agency in 2018 thinking I'll come back, I will learn about Medicaid operations, which really hadn't been where I lived when I was in the data and research team, and get that in spades in the long-term care system. There's a lot of operations work. And that might sound like you don't really need a PhD for it. But I resonated when Ryan said he uses his PhD every day, though I think we are using them in very different ways. I do use things that I learned in school, but I think most importantly, there's probably two things that I've brought with me forever since I started, probably not just since I left. One is, I don't know how many of you are at this point in your PhD, but when people try to describe to you like the difference between your comprehensive exams and your dissertation, and that one is about breadth and seeing the entire universe and being able to make connections between the entire universe. And then you have to turn and write your dissertation, which is about zeroing in on a pinpoint somewhere. I'm really more of the not pinpoint person. And I think that so much of my coursework and this is going to be an unpopular opinion, preparing for my comprehensive exams was really good, a really good learning experience for me, because solving complex problems in any policy area or any area of the government or public life requires finding potentially extremely disparate sources of information or solutions and bringing them to bear on one really tough problem. And there are lots of places with tough policy problems. That's always been what attracted me to long-term care, is a very complicated area of Medicaid policy. But that's really, you have to really think wide when you're solving some really complicated policy problems. The other thing was, and this is sort of, I said I just wanted to keep going to school, and that's why I did a PhD, and that sounds like a terrible reason. There's an actually even worse reason that I'm not sharing. But I did really enjoy being in classes with really smart people and talking to them about complicated problems, even when I didn't necessarily understand the problem because it wasn't necessarily my policy wheelhouse. But I think that's also given me tools for conducting difficult conversations in the government. And again, going back, we have a lot of complicated problems to solve. How do you get all the smart people in the room to understand the problem, figure out what our options are, and implement a solution? And often in the government, you have, we know things move slowly, but it's often because you need people from different functional areas to all agree on where you're going. And I think navigating some of those conversations has been much easier because of the group of folks I went to school with and the professors that I had, and just cultivating that that sort of skill set, or at least that sensibility.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Catherine. So I think we want to throw it open to questions from the audience. And as Denise said, you can either put a question in chat, you can raise your hand, either literal, well, I can't see everybody, so that wouldn't work, but you can type questions in the chat is one way to do it, and make sure you have it addressed to everybody. Or you can, there's a raise your hand option, which you can do under reactions. So we have a question from Finn Dobkin. And oh, by the way, if your question is directed at one person in particular, make sure you mention that in the question. So I lost Finn. Let me find him again. Show, whoops, that didn't work. Here we go. Finn said, how did you leverage your dissertation during your job search? And that's for everybody, I guess.
So I can take a swing at this one because mine's the most straightforward. I actually had to give a traditional academic job talk to go work at CNA. So I revised and expanded my dissertation defense presentation and actually used that in the interview process. So there was a very direct connection in my case.
Okay. Anyone else want to answer that one?
Yeah, I feel like I had the opposite experience. I did mention, like, I didn't come to long-term care sort of on purpose, but I skipped this part. When I came to the Medicaid agency to do data and research, because it's a third of our budget, that was what a third of our analysis needed to focus on. So there was a really big need on the long-term care analytics side. And that is what ended, first of all, that's like what has led to me being a long-term care director. That's one. But it also made me write a long-term care dissertation, which I probably would not have predicted in 2009 when I started the program. But I wrote about a program that was currently under evaluation by a competitor of my employer at the time. And so there was a lot of navigating some kind of interesting federal and contractual relationships to ensure that I had two chairs. One was Donna Infeld, and one was a researcher at ASPE. And she really wanted me to have access to, of course, to everyone I wanted to talk to. And so she was a great champion for navigating some of those very non-academic, like that was a very, very contractory environment that we were working through to, and it was interesting because I felt that it could impact, where my job went after that, based on how that went.
Yeah, I was going to add that similarly. So Catherine and I actually work in related fields and interact a lot of the time. But I similarly leveraged my dissertation for my job. I had started at MacPac at the time. I was brought on as the long-term services and supports principal analyst and was starting off a dissertation and really wanted to have some synergy between my dissertation and the work I did day to day. So that's how I kind of framed my dissertation. But then that did become part of my, body of work that, as I was serving as a principal analyst for LTSS, my dissertation supported that. And then that supported, me making my moves from there in terms of my next jobs, my other opportunities that have come through, like speaking opportunities and things like that. So certainly very relevant to, use for my future job searching, but a little different than, again, kind of an academic route. So.
and mine was even less direct. My PhD was in really kind of sociology. It was race policy on racial portrayals in the media. That doesn't line up too well with environmental protection work. So it was very valuable, great experience, but did not have any direct impact on my job search.
Interesting. Okay. Right. Any more questions? Otherwise, I have a few, and Denise has questions as well. So,
Looks like a question just came in.
oh
Bert.
yes, it did. Okay. Let's see. And the question is, not very good at, there we go. Chat, no?
So
Okay.
I can read it. It's, have any of your positions provided opportunities to publish your work in academic journals?
I'll take a stab at that one first, I guess. Again, so the short answer is yes, in the sense that it is encouraged, and depending on what you're writing about, generally helpful to your day-to-day kind of operations, at least in my line of work. But it is also just, it can be difficult to find the time to do it, because usually, within the FFRDC, you're working on particular projects for sponsors. And so the money to support the time that you use to do those academic publications needs to come from somewhere. So either a very willing sponsor that wants to see some of their work published in an academic journal, and I'm working with one of those right now with the Office of the Secretary of Defense that is interested in potentially publishing some of the work in an academic journal. But that's not always the case. So it's not, it kind of varies from case to case, but also you can do it on your own time if you're so inclined, and that doesn't, it's not, it is a supporting effort, if you will. It's not totally orthogonal to what it is that we do.
Anyone else want to take a crack at that question?
Sure, I would say I have not yet published an academic journal. I'm certainly, a lot of us, I'm sure, are published, and particularly in, as people have worked in government, agency documents. Sometimes your name isn't directly attached to them, but you're doing a lot of the writing and research that you would do for a journal. But there are definitely opportunities, like where I work now as a consultant. We're encouraged to, for example, the big health policy journal, Health Affairs, is one where a lot of people in my field tend to write to. And while I haven't published, I've participated in reviewing, being a reviewer on some articles, participating in some other events that they've had. So I certainly think that having a PhD lends itself to being involved, continuing to be involved in that world. And there's certainly opportunities to pursue publishing in the future.
Anyone else want to answer that one? I know I spent 17 years after my first job. I left academia for 17 years before coming back. And I found that when I was outside academia, I had to spend my own time to try and write some things. And it was very helpful at being able to move back to academia after that. So I'd encourage all the students to keep working at it, and also our panel to keep trying to write things when you get a chance. Okay, our next question is from Odia Kaba. How have you seen the field of public policy evolve or change during your career? And how have you adapted to those changes?
I mean, I can, because my position, I work a lot with political leadership at EPA. And so we're very much driven by who's in the administration. And just going back a few administrations, there's been considerable swings in our approach to regulation, and working on a range of issues across the country. So, and that's part of that variability and having to adapt in just that dynamic environment was what drove me to this, and why a career in academia wasn't as suited for me. But that was just inherent in the work and just being in Washington.
Okay. Anyone else want to answer that one?
I would just, I think it's hard for me to always think of myself as in the field of public policy, because for Medicaid, you know, whether you're a like public health person or a public policy person, it's kind of mixed. I do think that the Medicaid and health policy space has changed so much over the last very short period of time. I was in the beginning of my PhD, I guess, when because I was in my first job when ACA was passed, and there's just been a lot of things that have happened since then, building on that. But also, it's I mean, the pandemic was one thing. The pandemic was, and I think this is also, you know, Dan mentioned the sort of political aspect. There's also this real-time aspect to me that's always been this intersection of operations and policy, because and that's maybe what's been really interesting working in the operations of a program, because it's not just a policy problem. You're responding to a very real environment, and nothing is realer than a global pandemic, and how healthcare coverage and the health system and long-term care facilities and all of that respond to it. I think one other thing that's interesting that's happened is kind of, in my opinion, this is just an opinion, during the pandemic, a few other policy priorities kind of got on hold because we couldn't do everything all at once. And so there were things already coming down the pike prior to the pandemic. And a lot of that kind of came out in a rush once we thought the pandemic was over. And it's just, there's so many things happening right now, and it's sort of stuff piling on top of stuff. And they are all interesting policy priorities, but again, it's sort of policy crashing in a real life. There's only so many people working on these things, and we all have to do all of the same things. And so that's been very interesting to observe. It's just been a really prolific and busy and at times crushing period of time in the health policy space.
Okay, while we're waiting for someone else to come up with a question, I've got another one I'm curious about. So now that you've all been in your jobs for a few years, are there any skills that you wish you had paid more attention to learning while you were in graduate school, that now that you're in jobs, you say, oh, I wish I'd learned more about statistics or organizational behavior. So just curious about anything you want to encourage them to pay attention to.
So I'll take a swing at it. So for me, the thing that I spend the most amount of time thinking about, and that I still need to brush up on is research design, broadly conceived, right? So not necessarily the nuts and bolts of particular methods or statistical techniques, but understanding, you know, which comparisons you're making and why those are the right comparisons and what the alternative explanations might be. And just putting a lot of deep thought into that, such that it kind of becomes more of a habit. I found that often my contribution, particularly when I'm sort of the analytical voice in the room, is not so much in like, you know, running, being able to understand some of the ins and outs of why, you know, these numbers don't mean what you think that they mean. And here's why, and being able to explain that cleanly in a way that that sort of withstands scrutiny. And usually that comes back to some element of research design. So spending a lot of time on that and really putting effort into understanding the principles of research design, I think has paid me a lot of dividends. And not just at CNA, in the work that I did in the COVID cell as well, because there were a lot of panic headlines. There's a lot of misinformation out there related to COVID-19, and just understanding the data and how that relates to the inferences that you want to make is just a really important skill set that crosses disciplines and will serve you well.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, we have another question in the chat from Odia. I recently attended another panel where the panelists agreed that as you progress through the job search process and as you climb the career ladder, it increasingly hinges on who you know, i.e. networks and connections. Would you agree with that?
I had a class in my MPH and the professor, somebody asked a very similar question in that class, and he was like, it's absolutely who you know. But before you get mad, because I'm sure he saw all of it, and a lot of us like still pretty early on in careers, and we're like, that's not fair. His explanation was, and especially I think this is, this might not be true just everywhere, but it's definitely super true in DC if you're looking for a policy job. They're going to get hundreds of resumes, and having some personal connection that means that somebody actually looks at your resume and your letter can be really important. And it doesn't have to be, I hear some things in this thread and I'm like, that sounds, I'm trying to avoid using the word gross and not getting there, but it sounds unfair. But it doesn't have to be. And I have, I'm naturally extremely extroverted. Those of you who already know me know that. But I've never necessarily thought that I was really good at networking. And so one of my areas of focus the last few years has been a former colleague and an MPH classmate was like, just have coffee with people you used to work with. It doesn't have to be milking connections or you're looking for a job. It's just actually maintaining contacts. And the longer you've worked, the more incidental contacts you have. And you actually like those people. And so it could just be having coffee with a person you used to like to work with. And then you get to talk about all the people you used to work with, good or bad, whatever. And you maintain that healthy network. So then when you have a question or you do want to look for something, there's a little bit of a more natural and robust infrastructure in place, and it doesn't necessarily feel as transactional.
Yeah, and I add that I think it's a combination of things. I totally agree with Catherine, but it's experience, it's education, and it's connections. And I think the further, you'll have the education, of course, down with the program, but the further you get from your educational background, the experience and the connections are going to grow, I think, in their importance, because, you're going to have worked longer. What kind of experiences and skills have you collected along the way? And then, to Catherine's point, a lot of it is your peers. I think sometimes networking always feels like it has to be, upwards, looking for someone who's going to be your boss. But a lot of the connections and the job opportunities I've had have been because of people I worked with as an associate, as a consultant at age 24. Like people I had, went to happy hour with, went to lunch with, are people who are still in my network. I was at a conference today where I ran into a couple of those folks. So it doesn't have to be networking in a way that feels, false or phony or but again, to Catherine's point, just keeping those connections going, because friends will become, the kinds of connections that will send you leads or recommend you to someone in the future.
Actually, it's interesting. I think just to add something quickly, who you know is not a fixed thing. And you can change that pool by going to conferences, by contacting people who are working at places you're interested in. And I know in my career, that's been very helpful sometimes. And it sounds like from what we've heard, people are saying some similar things.
Yeah, I would second that. I was going to make a very similar point, Bert, which is that, who you know at the start of the program is one thing, but like you have all of these opportunities that being in a PhD program sort of facilitates that you can use to grow your network. And your network, as Crystal said, it's not just the people above you, it's the people that you're in grad school with, it's the people that you meet at conferences, it's the people that you are on a panel with, it's your coworkers that move on to other things. That's how your network really grows over time. And so it almost, as long as you don't actively or you just put yourself in positions where you might actually get to interact with somebody that's interested in the same things you are, and your network will kind of naturally grow. If you can be intentional about it, all the better. But it does matter who you know. It does help, and I can point to very specific examples in my career where who I know helped a great deal. But it's not because I stalk them and pass them my business card in a parking garage at some point. It was sort of these natural connections that grow over time. And I like to think go both ways, because eventually you will probably be in a position to help somebody that you knew when you were in grad school or that you met at a conference, and you'll be able to help them the same way. So you're part of somebody else's network.
Thanks. See, we have another question, which is, were you involved in, this is from Naomi, were you involved in any organizations during school? Did this experience help you in your professional career in any way?
I'll jump in. So yes, I was a full-time student, which comes with a lot of benefits. So one of them is the ability to sort of participate in some extracurricular activities. So I got my master's degree down at the Elliott School there at GW before I jumped up to the Trachtenberg School, and I maintained a lot of relationships down there at the Elliott School. So I was a part of the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies. I was down there in the Elliott School for about 4 years while I was in the PhD program. I was also a member of several, the societies, International Studies Association, American Political Science Association, those kinds of things. And I attended conferences. I occasionally presented at conferences, and that did help me. It helped me build my network. It also gave me experience doing research, presenting research, which obviously serves me well now because that's a major part of my job is to do studies and then do studies on a timeline and then present that study to audiences that aren't necessarily familiar with the subject matter.
Denise, did you want to break the group up, or we have one more question if we have time? You're on mute.
Sorry, it looks like we've got one more question that just came in, Bert, and looks like these are some really great questions. So let's try to maybe do that, and then we'll open up the groups for the last 10 minutes. And
Okay.
because I'm unmuted, I can just read it. Further to Professor Barnow's earlier question, what transferable skills do PhD students possess that make them valuable in non-academic careers? How can PhDs communicate these skills to potential employers? And what are current trends or demands in the job market for PhD graduates seeking non-academic careers? And have you all found that there's some emerging fields that are particularly interested in hiring individuals with this background? So some of those questions, if people, I can also answer depending on from a broader perspective, but would love to hear from our panelists.
I'll jump in with a couple of thoughts. In terms of transferable skills, I would definitely say critical thinking, research design, and writing. But then also just the kind of grit and determination you get from doing your dissertation is something I think that's very transferable. So.
I was going to say the same thing. We have had a couple PhDs in the long-term care administration. I don't think we historically did, but I think we at one point had three. It's not a small group, but there were 3 research PhDs in the group, and that was a very high number. And to me, it's like, it's exactly what Crystal said. Is like, I know that you can tackle a big project and that you can unpack it and push your way through it. And it's a little like, it's sort of a combination of the research method that you're a problem solver and you can, and I think that Crystal also mentioned the writing. I think that's also really important. There are a lot of people who get into professional careers and essentially have no academic writing training of any kind. And so that's taken very for granted. And you don't get out of a PhD program without writing a lot of things. So that is an undersold skill. And I think that's also, I don't think enough people sort of brag about that when they're applying for a job. If you feel like you're a good writer and you get feedback that you're a good writer, that's something to advertise to prospective employers if you think writing will be any part of your job.
Anything anyone else wants to add to that one?
Yeah. So I agree with everything that's been said so far. I'll just put my own little spin on it. It's you are going to pick up a lot of very transferable skills, but the way that you package those might be a little bit different depending on which job you're seeking. Writing is kind of universal, so if you write well, definitely highlight that. But your research design skills, which I think are extremely transferable in a wide variety of contexts, but most of your employers won't know it by that term. That it might go under something like data literacy, or it might go under something like your ability to evaluate evidence or something along those lines. So just be cognizant that these buzzwords out there, are getting at skills that you will probably pick up and possess by the time that you're done with the program. But that you just have to sort of frame your skill set in that language because you will have it.
Fantastic. And just to add to whoever asked that question, to all of you, is this is something that we are happy to have further conversations about in through career services on how to frame your documents, your resume, your CV, your applications, and what fields. Like I can speak to, federal government absolutely is a field that really looks for people with PhDs. So that we can talk further about your specific needs. So with that, I want to thank Bert for moderating very much. Really always appreciate your expertise, and all of our alumni who just share such valuable insights in what, 50 minutes, some really powerful information.